diminishes the freedom of others. I thank you once again for allowing me the opportunity to address you, particularly you, Mr. President and Secretary General. I wish all of you leave this room determined to make good trouble. Thank you very much.
I thank the chair of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. We will now proceed to the Nelson Mandela Prize Award ceremony for our two laureates. It is my honor to present Mrs. Brenda Reynolds, Indigenous social worker from Canada. Ms. Reynolds is supported today by a proud community of Indigenous women and girls, men and boys. We warmly welcome to the General Assembly's Hall today the daughters of tradition and the sons of tradition visiting from the state of Wisconsin in the United States. Their presence here underscores the vital importance of preserving indigenous cultures and traditions with our global community. It also serves as a reminder that the work we honor in our laureates today has a profound impact on the lives of indigenous people. I invite Mrs. Brenda Reynolds to the stage to receive the 2025 United Nations Nelson Mandela Prize presented by the Secretary General of the United Nations. We will now hear a statement by Mrs. Brenda Reynolds, the 2025 United Nations Nelson Mandela Prize laureate. Mrs. Reynolds, you have the floor.
Thank you, Your Excellency and Mr. Secretary General, honored members of the United Nations, esteemed delegates, including the Daughters of Tradition and Sons of Tradition. Thank you for joining us today, and my family members who have traveled here with me, and friends, and others who are watching at home and in their workplaces. Miigwech. I wish to respectfully acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional homeland of the Lenape people. Sorry if I mispronounced that. When I first found out that I was one of the two laureates for this year's Nelson Mandela Awards, I was speechless and couldn't believe that I was selected. And even though I speak two languages, I still cannot find the words to express the depth of my gratitude and the humility I have to accept the United Nations Nelson Mandela Prize. And happy birthday to him in the heavens today, because now he is one of our ancestors. To receive a prize that holds the name of an iconic man who embodied peaceful resistance and reconciliation is a tremendous honor and a solemn responsibility. I am moved by the recognition by the United Nations, which continues to uphold the ideals of justice, peace, and human dignity. I am a Saulteaux woman from Fishing Lake First Nation, a reserve in Canada, who shared similar parallels to Nelson Mandela's experiences with our government's efforts to civilize and change who we are as Indigenous people to our homelands. And there are many parallels to what we had experienced in both our countries, where the governments impacted policies to change who we are, to face oppression, to face a violation of human rights in our countries. And it is from that perspective that I have been following and have had an interest in Nelson Mandela since I found out about him. One outstanding example, is when the South African government came to Canada during the 1930s to ask the Canadian government, how do you manage your Indigenous people? The response was, we have them segregated on reserves, where they have to have a pass when they leave the reserves. We also give them status cards to identify who they are. That practice, some of those practices, became the model that is known as apartheid in South Africa. A government practice here in Canada, not here, but in Canada, started by the forced removal of Indigenous children in the 1800s. The children were separated from their families, from their communities, and from their cultures, and placed in residential schools for the purpose of civilizing them, and also to eradicate their cultures. While attending the residential schools, the children experienced severe abuse. And one of the things that they were not permitted to do was to speak their language. But some of the abuse included the emotional abuse, where they were made to feel ashamed of who they are as Indigenous people. And I was not a residential school student, but my experience started when I became a counselor at Gordon's Indian Residential School in 1988. At that time in Saskatchewan, Gordon's was the only federally operated residential school. And while I was there, just before the end of the school year, one 13-year-old girl came to me and said she wanted to share with me her experiences of what was happening in the residential school. She was being sexually abused by a senior staff member. At the end of the night, we had 17 girls disclose that they were being sexually abused by the same staff member. And subsequently, I started hearing from other students about their experiences, and some of them were former students at that time, but they had also were talking about their own experiences of sexual abuse. And the person, that senior staff member, he was charged and convicted, and he became the first person of a residential school to be convicted. So these charges were the beginning of other disclosures that came from across Canada, from survivors who were speaking about their sexual abuse experiences. Those charges and disclosures became the largest class action lawsuit to date in Canada, and that lawsuit is known as the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. Under the settlement agreement was a provision to provide emotional support, for Canada to provide emotional support. And I was asked to develop a pilot called the Resolution Health Support Program. And I developed the program that included training Indigenous people from communities and cultural support workers to provide emotional support to survivors, their families, and once the Truth and Reconciliation started in Canada, we provided support to Canadians attending the hearings that we had across Canada. And what I did for 7 years, when I trained the workers on a monthly basis, I train them to understand what the long-lasting effects of childhood trauma and what those impacts are on their survivors and also intergenerationally. But we have to remember that trauma experienced in genocide is not the trauma that is defined in the Western sense. In the Western sense, trauma is an experience where it's a short, brief experience, and then you return to a normal state. But when you're experiencing genocide, you learn to live with the trauma, and that has severe impacts on you. And so these experiences of abuse and the eradication, the attempt to eradicate the culture, and were some of the experiences that we started to hear in the beginning of the settlement agreement. And we also heard of students going through medical experimentation, and we still continue to hear of cases of forced and coerced sterilization. But when someone is living in a state of trauma, they stay in that elevated state of response, and that becomes normal because you're with a perpetrator and you're living in a system where you are facing racism and discrimination. And secondly, what I did with the trainer when I was training the workers was that for them to understand the settlement agreement and what the provisions were and what options were for the survivors that they can go through under the settlement agreement. And I did this at a grade 3 education level because this is what the survivors were saying, is that I went to school for 8 years, but I came out with a grade 3 education. So for them to understand what was available to them, I ensured that the information we provided was at a grade 3 level that they can understand. Furthermore, what I did is I also included Indigenous culture as a part of the healing, the education, and the emotional support. The eradication of the culture was to not be comfortable with who you are as an Indigenous person, and that our ways were heathen ways. And so, but I know from my own experience that culture was healing for me and was a part of my identity and a part of my own healing. And I was fortunate to grow up with my cultural ceremonies and practices in my own language ever since birth. And in all Indigenous cultures, as we traveled across Canada and as we worked with people, is that there are healing practices in words where we can understand what trauma is and how it impacts us and what those symptoms are. And so it was important to me to have that included as the healing process. And so we provided emotional support to survivors as they proceeded through the hearings of serious harms. We had one category within the settlement agreement where serious harms were done in private hearings. And now we had over 36,000 people that went through those hearings in serious harms. And what Canada has done is destroyed the evidence from those hearings so that they cannot be opened and shared. So that was one of the unfortunate things that has happened. And when the TRC started, we started taking statements, started having public hearings, and we would have public and private hearings for truth-telling. And like I had said previously, that's when we started hearing more experiences of the violation of human